said, we've got to match design with risk. So, risk is a measure of the likelihood and the consequence. In order to properly measure risk, you have to measure both. It's important to measure both. And you've got to measure both properly and accurately. Okay? How often can it happen? And what will be the outcome if it does happen? That's essentially that statement in English. So the people affected by those consequences are the risk receptors, not the people, the objects, if you want to call it that. It's the people, it's the business, it's the environment, it's your corporate image, it's your liability, it's the market share, all that sort of thing is at risk. So if you're having accidents, these things are going to be affected. You might be killing personnel, but you might be losing company image and you might be losing market share. So having an accident, not only on people, it's on your business as well as the environment. Don't forget the environment piece. Okay, so why manage risk? Now, companies are obliged, because they have a legal, moral, and financial obligation to manage those risks. Okay? You have a moral obligation. You need to make the plant as safe as possible, disregarding cost. Okay? Now, this is the approach when you design a nuclear power station. That plant is made as safe as possible, irrespective of cost. That's why they cost billions of dollars. One unit, I think the going price for a Westinghouse AD 1600, I think, is $32 billion for one reactor. Because there the safety is built in. They don't care about keeping the price down. They're worried about safety. So they are building the safest possible plant. It is, if you look at the stats, nuclear safety is extremely safe. Nuclear plants are extremely safe, the modern ones. They are extremely safe compared to a lot of petrochemical plants. Secondly, you have to comply with the regulators. You have to comply with the local regulations of your company. You have to comply with the local regulations of your country. Whatever they are, you have to comply. You need an operating license. To get that, you've got to show the regulator, the person issuing the license, that you're going to operate safely, that you've met certain criteria. And then you have shareholders. Okay, you're not in business to employ people, you're in business to make money. Otherwise, you're going to shut down. You're not there as a charity, you're there to make money. So you're trying to build the cheapest plant with the smallest operating budget and the smallest maintenance budget. So you've got all of these things pulling, and you're trying to reach an optimal point in the middle. That's the balance. So if you understand all of these, you can develop safety policies that are consistent with all of that. Okay? Then you can start to understand what you've got to manage and how you've got to manage it. But in order to do that, you've got to measure your risk properly. You've got to understand what hazards have you got here? What risks do you have on this plant? Otherwise, you're just floundering around in the dark. So that's the key. You've got to know what you've got to manage. What hazards do we have on our plant? Okay, so the basis for risk tolerance is the fact that if you don't take a risk, then you cannot get benefits. We know it's risky to produce oil and gas. We know it's risky to have a refinery running. But there's a benefit to be derived from it. So, we take those risks in order to get those benefits. So, first of all, zero risk does not exist. There's a risk with everything. There's a risk with waking up in the morning. There's a risk with breathing in. There's a risk with climbing into the shower. There's a risk associated with everything. Some activities are more risky than others, but we've got to understand every single activity and what risk does it pose. Now, if you look at this mouse, he's looked at this cheese and said, I want that cheese and I'm prepared to manage it. I'm going to put a helmet on. If I was this situation and I was asked to assess this, I would insist on being the second mouse. And the first mouse gets drilled. This cheese is then freely available. Okay? But it's about understanding what risk you're prepared to take. Okay? And then putting the necessary measures in place to manage that risk. Now, this slide is about what CFSEs are about. It's about safety. It's about risk reduction. And this is the key thing behind this whole exercise. We have a process and it has an inherent risk. And an example is a tank full of gasoline, petrol. It has a certain risk posing to the facility, to the public, to whatever. 5,000 litres of petrol can get you to the moon and back several times. It has a lot of energy. If you lose control of it, you're in trouble. So you start off with that process risk. Now, through design and through the process itself, you can do risk reduction. You can reduce your risk. So you put it in a tank with a floating roof and maybe a vented space with nitrogen in it to stop the baby space explosion. So by design and process, you reduce your risk. You then have a process control system that will limit the level through normal. You try and stop the overflow when it reaches the top level. Something happens, the inlet valve closes, and maybe you live swing to another tank. So you do risk reduction. If something goes wrong, then you flag the operator with an alarm and say, please help. And the operator does something to bring it back to normal. And also reduces the risk. Any relief system, a PSV, safety relief valve, will lift to prevent rupture of a vessel. It's there to prevent the rupture, so it will do risk reduction. Now, that process risk, if we were to lose control of it, it would impact on people, the environment, and your business in a certain way. Now, based on our previous slide, the risk tolerance, what we're prepared to tolerate, defines our tolerable risk for this specific hazard. And you define that up front. That's what's called the tolerable risk guidelines. So based on the basis of that, you compare where you've got to with your analysis in terms of all these protection layers. And if there's a gap, there's a place for a SIF. And depending on how big the gap is, and depending on how much safety factor you want for your SIF, you install a SIF with the necessary SIL value. You may, through the analysis, realize that you've actually gone past tolerable risk. You've got enough in place, so you don't need a SIF. But you wouldn't know that unless you've done the analysis. You've got to analyze each hazard. And it's my experience that with a lot of the older plants where they've installed safety systems on the basis of prescriptive standards, that you go through the cause and effect and through the PNIDs, and a lot of the SIFs drop away because they've already got enough protection in place. So they may have a system with 300 SIFs in it. At the end of the analysis, they may be left with 150. And now they're going to go through an upgrade process. They've got an old system, and they want to go to the latest generation. So instead of upgrading 300 SIFs, they only have to upgrade 150. So there's a massive saving to be made. Okay. But they wouldn't have been able to make that saving unless they'd done this analysis. So that's the key here. You've got to analyze it to know where you stand in terms of your process risk and your tolerable risk. Okay. So risk and benefit, they go hand in hand. If you know the benefits and you know the loss of benefit, risk due to an accident, then you can measure your risk. You're now bringing loss of benefits into the equation, bringing that benefit issue into the risk equation. Okay? But you need to be measuring all forms of harm: environment, personnel, business, and in some cases, third party, the community. You need to be measuring that. Okay, especially as a consequence. Okay, how do we define that? It's who's being exposed and what is the nature. So, who is being exposed? Individual, society, the environment, your business, and if it was exposed, what would be the nature? Okay, is it injury? Is it fatality? Is it permanent? Is it temporary damage to the environment? Is it a financial loss? Are you put out of business? That kind of thing. You need to be measuring the consequence properly. Okay? And this comes out of the Cairo Alpha explosion. Okay? This, if you've seen the video, you'll see how frightening a gas explosion can be. When they have a full bore rupture, 3 tons a second coming out of a pipe. That's what happens. It goes wrong. Okay, if you watch that video, I've got a copy of it with Sammy. A BBC crew was there. They were filming something else. And they happened to be in the vicinity of Cairo when it happened. So that footage is not made up. That actually happened. These pictures are real. They're not Hollywood CGI. Okay, so we want to assess our risk. We want to look at the nature of the risk. And there are several ways of doing it. For personnel, there's 3 ways. Individual risk assessment. Okay? So you consider one person, and you consider all the hazards that he's been exposed to on the plant. So when you go to work every morning, and you walk into the plant, there's not just one place that can kill you. There may be 7 or 8 places on that plant that have the potential to kill you. So you look at it from an individual basis, and you define tolerability based on a single individual. So that's he's exposed to all those hazards on the plant. And you don't want his risk, his total risk, to be above a certain value. You want to try and engineer his risk down below a certain value. Scenario-based risk assessment, you look at it on a scenario basis. Overflow of a tank with a pool fire, death and destruction, or whatever. Or overpressure of a column with a jet fire, whatever. Okay, so that would be scenario-based. And then societal. Now the best example, the saddest example I can give is Bhopal. Where they released methyl isocyanate out of the plant, and it drifted on the morning, came out early morning, it drifted, it descended on the town of Bhopal, it's killed, I think the total now is 25,000 people. That morning itself, I think 16,000 people died. They were all asleep, men, women and children, all sleeping, killed by a chemical accident, a plant accident. The society was affected. None of the operators were affected because the plume went up and down and it descended outside the plant boundary. Okay, so you need to look at this. There may be scenarios that leave your facility. Individual risk, the UK has defined certain bands. This is for a single individual. And they define the bands as the tolerable and intolerable regions. And they set figures to it. It was the first country in the world to set figures to it. There's a problem with that. I'll explain that now. Okay, so unacceptable region is 1 death every 1,000 years. Your chance of dying is once every 1,000 years. Whereas the acceptable region is 1 death. Your chance of dying is 1 in a million years. and the ALOC region falls between those two boundaries. Now the problem with putting a number to this is you're now putting a finite lifetime on a person. You're defining something that you regard as acceptable, a likelihood of dying on a person, which in terms of the moral aspect, the lawyers would have a field day with this. Because if you consider it, you've got one death every 1,000 years, the border between the red and the orange region. If you've got 1,000 people on your plot, that means that you're going to have one death a year if you're operating according to this. So your boundary there is you may be tolerating, you're in a lab region, one death every year. That's what you're starting. If you start to do the math, you start to do the calculation. If you've got 10,000 people, then you may be 10 deaths a year, which you may be regarding as acceptable. I don't know. That's why they've said it is the border. You've got to try and get to the green region, which is once every million years. If you land in this orange region, you have to demonstrate why you cannot get to the green region. You have to do an ALOC demonstration. ALOC stands for as low as reasonably practicable. What it is, you have to demonstrate that the cost was too high to go any further down. The implementation of any further measures far outweighed the cost of that, far outweighed where you currently stand. It's just too expensive to implement. But you have to demonstrate that. If you just land in the orange region and move on and leave it there, you're operating in a region which the legal fraternity might regard as unacceptable. Okay. So we have what they call tolerable bounds of acceptable and unacceptable. They are defined for us. This has become accepted worldwide. The HSE published that I think in 1998. It has become accepted worldwide now. There's no reason you shouldn't be using it. It's regarded as good industry practice now. The insurance industry has grabbed onto this. And they regard that as something you should be striving to achieve. If you land